So about a month ago, Agron tweeted out that the Blizzard devs were looking for feedback on a few classes to change. And this really got my hopes up for Shadow Priest in Season of Discovery. I really thought that they were going to put the time and effort into making this a real DPS class instead of a utility bot. And unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the problems with Shadow Priest, what Blizzard tried to do to fix it, and how I think they can fix it going forward. Now, the number one problem with Shadow Priest in my mind is their high utility, low damage playstyle. In a vacuum, I don't think this is a bad thing. There is just no alternative playstyle. What if I want the high damage, low utility playstyle? What if I want medium damage, medium utility playstyle? There is nothing you can do to increase your damage beyond what it currently is, which is below pretty much every single tank in the game. So that's a big problem. It's not the fact that DPS is so imbalanced that it basically resembles original classic. That is not the point here. The point here is that we are below not just all the DPS classes, but pretty much all of the tanks as well. The only class we're actually above is an Arcane Mage, which, if you're not familiar with Season of Discovery, is actually a healer now. So there not being a way to modify your playstyle really is a problem, especially with how runes are supposed to be able to adapt and maneuver your playstyle. You really just have one shadow rune per slot because everything else is filled with healing runes. A second big problem is Shadow Priest has basically become this zookeeper of useless pets. The pet AI in World of Warcraft is absolutely terrible. We have homunculi, which is actually 3 pets in one, that really don't ever attack the target you want them to. And when they do attack, usually they end up breaking a CC or attacking a target you didn't want them to. We also have Eye of the Void, which is a really annoying pet to use because it applies a curse, which is really nice, as it allows us to replace warlocks in order to deal damage from Curse of Elements or Curse of Shadows. But the pet itself barely does damage whatsoever. Now you pair this with an equally useless rune on our head slot, which Eye of the Void is also on your head slot, and you just have 2 runes that feel extremely underwhelming and honestly bad to play with. And the one problem that Blizzard did actually try to fix is that we would pretty much only have 1 rune per slot. And when we did have 2 shadow runes per slot, it was a pretty obvious choice over which one we would take. But for a class that is already dealing extremely low damage, that means we were forced to take Dispersion in our boot slot because we didn't have a damage rune in our boots. Dispersion's a fine ability, but when you don't need a defensive and you don't need your mana returned, it's basically useless. Now, what changes did Blizzard actually make? Well, one, they moved Void Plague from the chest to the boot slot, which is something I recommended in my video, so I can't really complain about that. I think overall that's a good change, though it does hurt Shadow Priest in PvP. Vampiric Touch is a new rune at 60, which just adds on to the plethora of utility that we have. So that's good and bad. And that's kind of it. When you look at the patch notes for the different classes, or just Priest in general, is far and away the one with the least amount of changes to it, which feels really, really bad because that's never a good sign in terms of the design. Blizzard has never really been a company that finely tunes something so that they get it right on the first try with a few lines of change. There's usually iterations and iterations to go through before they actually get something right. And usually the classes that get the most iterations are going to be the one with the most lines in an update, which unfortunately Priest is not. Now, one final thing that isn't really a change but does address one of the problems that Blizzard addressed was they wanted to make Mind Flay feel useful. And in our tier 1 set bonus, the 6-piece bonus from that makes our Mind Blast critical strikes buff our Mind Flay, so it reduces the channel time by 50% and increases its damage by 100%. I think this is a good change, but it should not be on a tier bonus. That is really, really poor design because you're essentially saying Mind Flay is still going to be useless unless you have this tier bonus, which means before, when you have it, Mind Flay is useless, and after you get rid of it, Mind Flay is again useless. I don't know why they would make this as a tier bonus. If they want to make Mind Flay an actual spell that people use for the duration of Season of Discovery, this was a terrible way to go about this change. I think the change is ultimately a good one, as it's also something I suggested in my video, but it's not accomplishing the goal. It accomplishes the goal for maybe 2 or 3 months, but before that time and after it, Mind Flay is a useless spell for Shadow Priest in PvE. I think this also just needs to be a core function of Mind Flay. They need to alter the spell Mind Flay so that your Mind Blast crits always buff Mind Flay in another way. And this also leads to another problem. When you look at the ranges of spells for Shadow Priest, With 3 out of 3 in our talent that gives extra range on our spells, Mind Spike is a 42-yard range. Our dots are a 36-yard range, and Mind Flay is a 24-yard range. Where the hell is the Shadow Priest supposed to stand? In melee range? Because we have 3 different sets of ranges on our abilities to attack a boss, which means if we're ever too far away from the boss anyway, Mind Flay is just another useless spell because you have to be so close to actually use it. This is another problem I talked about with Mind Flay, is that a lot of the core design of the spell is just utter garbage. The range on it is terrible, it can't crit on its own without help from another rune, and its damage is extremely bad. So did they make Mind Flay a usable spell? Kind of, but like not really. As in temporarily, it will be fine when you have all 6 pieces to tier 1, but before and after that, it is a dead spell in PvE. Now, when I talk about why these changes are bad, it really comes down to it seems like Blizzard chose the path of least resistance. They didn't try to iterate, they didn't try to make anything cool. They just said, okay, let's move this boot slot here and then let's give this tier bonus and call it a day. They didn't try to do anything. They didn't try to do anything with utility. They didn't buff any of the runes that are severely lacking in the damage they deal or the utility they provide. Like, I'll be honest, it feels like nobody at Blizzard actually cares about Shadow Priest. It seems like I'm just shouting into a void making these videos because nobody at that company cares about this class. Obviously, mages get a ton of love, and that's always been the case in the history of World of Warcraft, but Shadow Priest is always the forgotten redhead stepchild that the father doesn't really want in the marriage. He just wants to be married to the mage, and then the Shadow Priest just unfortunately comes along with it. So with all of that being said, how do I think Blizzard can fix this? Because I think there's still time. You know, Agron did say that none of these classes are in their final state, which I kind of find hard to believe, but there is time before Phase 4 launches. So let's try to help Blizzard about ways that we can improve Shadow Priest DPS, because that is ultimately the problem here. We have a lot of runes that provide barely any value whatsoever, and we're forced to take them because as a Shadow Priest, the only other options in those slots are healing runes, so we're just kind of stuck with what we get. And that is a big problem with Shadow. Okay, so number 1 change that I think they should make, I still think this is a really good idea. This is something I suggested in my last video. Give us a rune that reduces the effects of Vampiric Embrace and Vampiric Touch now, but increases the damage of the Shadow Priest to compensate. Now, I do see a problem with this rune in dad guilds or the slower to progress guilds. If you have a Shadow Priest who's a selfish player and they want to up their damage instead of helping the group, that can be a problem. But why does the Shadow Priest have to be forced to be the group player? Why can't that be some other class? Why can't another class sacrifice their damage in order to have utility? For the entire lifetime of Season of Discovery pretty much now, shamans have been the kings of mana return, and they've also been the kings of damage. So it's kind of a crap argument to say that because Shadow Priest has so much healing and mana return, that they need to have low damage to compensate. I'm kind of over that argument at this point because it just isn't true with the way Blizzard is balancing this game or lack of balancing this game. Number 2, get rid of the damn pets. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants their utility. I don't care. Put their utility onto a spell that just says applies these debuffs to the target, and that's it. I don't even care if those runes don't do damage. Now, getting rid of the pets probably isn't feasible, but there are some things we can do to actually make them good. I think number 1, Eye of the Void needs to do more damage. It is so underwhelming to use on a 3-minute cooldown, and it's still, if that curse gets resisted the one time you can cast it, it is a worthless pet. That needs to change. You need to be able to cast that curse more than one time, and it needs to deal more damage if we're going to have it. Because the other rune in the head slot, Pain and Suffering, really, really sucks. It does. Whether you think so or not, we get 1 global cooldown saved every 24 seconds. That is not good game design, especially when we have another rune that does the same thing better. Why would you use Pain and Suffering when instead you can just use Shared Pain that refreshes your Shadow Word Pain on 3 targets at once instead of just the 1? Pain and Suffering is where they should implement the changes to Mind Flay. That should be a part of that rune. It should say your Mind Flay range is increased to 30 yards. It should say your Mind Blast critical strikes reduce the duration and increase the damage of Mind Flay. That's where all of that should go into the Pain and Suffering rune. And if you're having trouble with how to implement that, just give us a new spell called Flay Insanity. We've already seen that Blizzard is dipping into retail with this Mage Fire Blast while casting thing. So the fact that they said earlier on that they weren't going to pull from later expansions is a bunch of crap. And finally, Shadow Priest needs some form of scaling. Right now, the only thing that Shadow Priest really scales with is shadow damage. There isn't anything that says your intellect or your spirit gives you spell power. And I think having something like that would be really powerful. If you look at the Holy Tree, there's a talent that already does this. But I think if this could be part of Shadow as a whole, or some way that we can benefit from our stats that isn't just, you gain mana regen from spirit, you gain mana from intellect. This could be a way for Shadow Priest to actually scale, because if you go back to TBC, Shadow Priest actually didn't start off that bad at the beginning in Phase 4 in Karazhan, Gruul, Magtheridon, but as you got later into the expansion, because they didn't scale, the gap between them and the top DPS just got wider and wider, and that's pretty much what we're seeing here as well. Shadow Priest needs some form of additional scaling in order to stay competitive, and it should not come in the form of a tier bonus. A tier bonus shouldn't be a core fix to the class. That should just be part of the class itself. If you're making a core fix in a tier set, then you're not going to make anybody happy, and it's just going to piss people off if they don't have it, because once they lose it, you're never going to use that spell again. There is still time to make this a really cool and fun and engaging class. They just need to put in the effort. They just need somebody to dig deep and put in some effort into this class, because it has not gotten the love that it deserves. All right, that's all I got in this video. Hopefully Blizzard listens, because honestly, I'm kind of getting tired of Shadow Priest being in the dumpster tier after tier in Season of Discovery. Anyway, my name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.